Do you believe people can really change? Or do they just get better at hiding things?
Easter dinners in my family were always less about faith or tradition and more about showing off, a ritual of polished dishes and sharper words where the table became a stage for whoever wanted to flex their supposed greatness that year. By the time I slipped into my seat at the far end, half hidden by a floral centerpiece that smelled faintly of lilies and dish soap, I already knew how the evening would go. Ethan, my older brother, would dominate the conversation with a voice just loud enough to sound casual, but calculated enough to demand every nod and laugh at the table. I had learned long ago that family holidays were less celebrations and more opportunities for him to crown himself king in front of an audience that didn't question the script. Ethan had been branded the prodigy from the moment he built his first clunky website in high school, a page that barely loaded without crashing, but to our parents it was equivalent to inventing the internet itself. That early myth never left him, and through the years he cultivated it like a farmer guarding his best crop. He strutted through family dinners with buzzwords plucked from articles he barely understood, tossing them into conversation like glitter, dazzling enough to keep everyone impressed, even when the substance was thin. My role, by contrast, was cemented early. I was the quiet one, the one who hadn't quite figured things out, the one whose accomplishments never made it into the small talk when the neighbors came over. It's strange how invisibility works. You can feel yourself vanish inch by inch every time your achievements are brushed aside, until you're not even surprised when no one notices. I remember one Thanksgiving when I casually mentioned I had taken the risk of starting a small consultancy, a project that had eaten months of sleepless nights and every ounce of courage I had left. The silence that followed was broken only when Ethan cleared his throat and launched into some tale about a networking event in San Francisco, and just like that the spotlight returned to him. My mother patted my hand and told me I'd find my lane one day, as if my effort was a hobby rather than the bones of something real. I laughed along because that's what you do when your family builds a hierarchy and you're at the bottom of it. That night, staring down the roasted ham and pastel-colored eggs, I realized nothing had changed. My father was already leaning forward, chin in hand, waiting for Ethan's first story like it was primetime television. My aunt, who worked at a law office, had angled her chair toward him in anticipation. Even the younger cousins, still scrolling on their phones, perked up when he cleared his throat. I braced myself, sipping water as if it could wash down the dread. Ethan launched into his usual act, speaking of venture capital rounds and market volatility with the same shallow confidence he once used to describe baseball stats. He exaggerated, I could tell, adding weight to deals that hadn't closed, inflating partnerships that were really just coffee chats, but no one here would ever question him. They laughed when he joked about the failures of other startups, nodding at his claim that he was one of the few who actually knew how to survive in tech. I sat quietly, spearing asparagus, reminding myself that this wasn't new, that every holiday followed the same script. Yet tonight there was something in the air, a faint crackle, a waiting silence behind his words, as though the walls of this little theater were thinner than anyone realized. As much as I wanted to roll my eyes or bite back with sarcasm, I held myself still, because experience had taught me that silence could be sharper than argument. I thought of the years Ethan had smirked across the table, calling me the cautious one, the artsy one, the one who didn't get the grind. I thought of how every compliment from our parents toward him had come with a backhanded note toward me. And I thought of the project I had been building quietly, away from the noise, a company whose details I never once paraded in front of them. It was like a secret seed planted in soil no one cared to check, sprouting roots far deeper than they would ever expect. The clatter of silverware filled the pause as he poured himself another glass of wine. He leaned back, glanced at me across the table, and smirked the same way he did when we were teenagers, and he beat me at board games, that self-satisfied curve of the mouth that meant he thought he was untouchable. Then, with everyone's eyes on him, he said it, words so rehearsed in their casual cruelty that they landed with the precision of a knife. Well, not everyone can survive in tech like me. The table chuckled softly, forks pausing midair, nods of agreement sliding toward him like offerings at an altar. My mother gave him that glowing look she always reserved for his little performances, and my father raised his glass as if to toast the truth of it. And me? I sat still, smiling faintly, because I had already felt the weight of the moment shifting, the faintest tremor before a storm that none of them saw coming. What I knew, and what Ethan clearly did not, was that survival in tech wasn't about noise or clever one-liners. It wasn't about who got the applause at Easter dinner. It was about strategy, patience, and sometimes silence. And while he basked in their admiration, unaware, I felt the corners of the evening sharpen around us. Someone else at the table knew the truth too, and soon enough, it was going to slice through his little kingdom like glass cracking under pressure. But not yet. For now, I kept chewing slowly, waiting, because the silence that followed his boast was the sweetest kind of cliff before the fall. If you have ever watched a magician work a crowded room, you know that the real trick is not the flourish at the end, but the casual patter that keeps everyone looking in the wrong direction. And as Ethan lounged back in his chair, carving the ham as though he had personally hunted it in the wilds of Silicon Valley, I felt the old irritation stirring like a hornet in my throat and decided calmly, deliberately, that I would not play the quiet assistant to his performance this time. Not because I wanted to steal his spotlight, but because I had carried my own light into enough dark rooms to know it did not need permission to be turned on. The truth is that my company began the way stubborn things usually do, as a dare I made to myself after one too many family dinners where I was praised for being so supportive, which is what people say when they want you to stay small and convenient. So I took the smallest savings I had and a ridiculous amount of caffeine and built a service that solved a boring problem that paid like clockwork, and while Ethan hustled through pitch decks full of words like disruption and moonshot, I signed unglamorous contracts with companies that cared less about hype and more about whether the data cleaned itself without breaking their week, which meant my growth looked like a slow heartbeat on a screen until one day it did not. I remember the first time a client called me at midnight on a Sunday and said, in a voice that sounded like they had finally exhaled after holding their breath for a year, that my system had saved them from a mess that would have cost 6 figures and several very red faces, and I stared at the ceiling in my dark apartment and let the relief wash over me until it almost felt like laughter. Because there is a certain kind of joy in finally being the adult in the room, especially when no one in your own family sees you that way. Meanwhile, Ethan's updates came in glossy bursts, all rooftop selfies and influencer panels, and I tried not to be cruel about it because the world is unkind enough without my help. But it was hard not to notice that his bragging grew louder exactly when his actual numbers grew soft. By the time Lent rolled around, I had already lived through a season of private negotiations and quiet signatures, of meetings where no one wore branded hoodies, because the only logo that matters in a merger is the one that will still exist next quarter. And I had learned to keep my face steady when people asked the sort of fishing questions that sound polite but smell like fear. So when Ethan tossed out his line at the table, "Not everyone can survive in tech like me," I smiled into my water glass and considered, for one trembling second, letting the truth crash down right there, and then, a tidal wave that would soak the linen and leave his crown floating like a toy boat, and then I remembered that patience is sweeter than spectacle. Still, I am not a saint, and revenge does not need fireworks to be delicious, so when my aunt, always eager to play cheerleader to whatever man sounded confident, asked Ethan how he handled the market this quarter, I tilted my head and, in the same gentle tone I used to discuss weather, wondered aloud whether he had found a solution for the churn problem he had mentioned at Christmas, because if churn keeps climbing while the burn rate stays hot, even the best rooftop photos begin to look like a farewell tour, and the fork paused halfway to his mouth as if the ham had stiffened into stone, and he gave a laugh that sounded light but did not reach his eyes, and he said something about focusing on core competencies, which is the kind of phrase you reach for when the numbers are sulking in the corner and won't speak. I did not press, because you never press when you can coil the conversation like a spring and let someone else step on it, so I raised my glass and, pretending innocence with all the sincerity of a fox in a henhouse, offered a toast to survivors and to the people who buy life jackets early, adding that some storms are planned for, and some are planned, a line that floated over the table like a harmless balloon until it bumped into his jaw and stayed there. And the older cousin snorted and the Younger ones looked up from their phones, and my mother gave me a look that said I was being unladylike, which is funny because what she really meant was that I was being visible. The small revenge landed not as a slap, but as a rearrangement of furniture, subtle enough that no one could accuse me of cruelty, yet firm enough that the room's gravity shifted, and I watched Ethan, who has never met a mirror he didn't like, turn his assessment inward for half a second as if he had mistaken his reflection for a stranger, and, because the universe adores timing when it wants to, my grandmother, who has never cared for rooftop parties, but reads the business section like a detective, set down her fork with the kind of delicate finality that makes even children sit upright, and she reached into that floral purse she carries like a weapon and tapped her phone as though she were checking the weather. And her eyes softened in that way that means she has connected dots other people pretend are stars. If you are waiting for me to gloat, you will be disappointed, because I had no interest in humiliating my brother with a speech about due diligence or the difference between public swagger and private math. My pleasure, such as it was, lived in the quiet alignment of truth with timing, so I simply offered my grandmother more potatoes and thanked her for always bringing the good rolls, and when she patted my hand, her thumb drawing a slow circle over my knuckles as if soothing a child after a nightmare, I felt a hum in the air that did not come from the kitchen light. Across the table, Ethan started another anecdote, something about a panel in New York where an investor had told him he was the future, but his words lacked their usual varnish, and, while the others leaned in, out of habit more than hunger, Grandma's phone buzzed with a soft insistence that made her lift her chin, and she looked not at him, but at me, a glance as light as a moth, but with the weight of a verdict, and as the table fell into that polite hush that happens before a blessing or a storm, she cleared her throat, the tiniest sound, and I felt the room pull taut like a wire as every eye turned toward the one person who never speaks unless it matters, and my brother, king of the rooftop, set down his knife as if he could sense that something sharp had arrived that was not in his hand. There is a particular kind of quiet that comes before a reveal, not the gracious pause of good manners, but the charged stillness that gathers when everyone at the table senses something unseen has taken a seat among them. And as my grandmother lifted her eyes from the screen and folded her napkin with that small precise motion I have watched her use for decades when she is preparing to correct an accountant or a pastor or a grandchild who thought he could glide past the truth, I felt the years spool backward to the beginning of the road I had taken without applause, a path made of early mornings that smelled like burnt coffee and too bright spreadsheets, of clients who did not care about innovation theater but phoned me in the middle of a Wednesday to ask whether the data would reconcile by Friday and whether they could survive the audit without loaning their blood pressure to the federal government. When I first registered my company, I did it in a borrowed co-working space that hummed like a fish tank and made me feel both capable and ridiculous, because ambition without audience can look like delusion if you squint. Yet I kept returning to the same chair with the wobbly wheel and refining a system that was not glamorous yet refused to fail, a system built to sweep up the forgotten mess beneath pretty dashboards, to make sure the same values matched in every column at 2 in the morning when no presentation could help you, and the only thing that mattered was whether the numbers told the same story twice. And when a small manufacturer in Ohio signed an annual contract because my tool did exactly what I promised and did it faster than their intern army, I celebrated alone with supermarket Prosecco and a roast chicken eaten straight from the container. Not because I am austere, but because I promised myself I would save ceremony for the day I did not need it. Meanwhile, my brother crafted a brand that sparkled like a storefront, a company with a mission statement that stretched across walls and told you it would change the world while treating payroll like a surprise party, and he became, with very little resistance from any of us, the hero of our family's weekend narratives, a man who could take one meeting and turn it into 3 dinners and a photo of his shoes on a private jet, and I, because I am not a saint and because my memory is long, watched the ratio between his noise and his numbers expand like a rubber band I knew would snap. I took notes without malice, the way a botanist observes invasive species. And when I heard him describe churn as a temporary blip while simultaneously hiring a head of culture, I wrote on a napkin that the house liked rugs more than foundations, and then I folded the napkin and went back to work. By late winter, the conversations that mattered in my world had moved into rooms without windows, the kind where a simple sentence like, "We believe there is synergy," actually means, "We would like to stop being anxious every Friday." And because I had built my company like a machine that hates drama, those rooms turned warm, and lawyers began marking documents with language so plain it almost sounds poetic. And the first time I saw Ethan's company name on the other side of a table where no one was taking selfies, I swallowed so carefully I could feel my pulse against my tongue, not out of shock but out of a grim comprehension that life occasionally hands you the perfect setup and asks whether you are grown enough to take it without gloating. I did not leak anything, because I did not need to, and I did not brag, because power that talks too soon becomes gossip. Yet I did one small thing that felt both petty and clean, a kind of housekeeping of the soul that I am not ashamed to call revenge. Because a month before Easter, I spent an afternoon at my grandmother's kitchen table showing her how to set up alerts on her phone for business news she cared about, and when she laughed and said she only wanted recipes and obituaries, I coaxed her into following the local paper and the regional business journal, promising that she would enjoy knowing which companies were doing well and which needed prayers, and I added my own company to the watch list along with a few others that shared suppliers. And she kissed my cheek and called me her diligent one, and I walked home in the slush with the honest warmth of that name fluttering in my chest like a stitched label finally visible on the inside of a jacket. So when her phone buzzed now, against the linen in that insistent little rhythm that belongs to news that wants to be read aloud, I watched Ethan's eyes flick there and back, fast as a fly. And I saw him decide to ignore it, because his life has taught him that interruptions are for other people, and I let the whole table bask in that polite hush for one long breath, then another. While inside me something unclenched that I had been hauling around since childhood, and as the pause stretched I allowed myself a second serving of private justice by turning to my father and asking, with all the kindness I could fit into one sentence, whether the carving knife felt balanced this year, because if the handle loosened again we could always tighten it. A comment so innocent it drifted over the china like steam, yet carried the suggestion that some tools are inherited for ceremony while the sturdier ones arrive from the hardware store you visit yourself. My aunt reached for the gravy as though that small motion could break the spell. My mother straightened the salt shaker as if order could be restored through symmetry. Ethan launched into an anecdote about a podcast host who had called him brilliant with the weary adoration of someone who is used to being adored, and my grandmother, who has never admired noise, flattened her hand over the phone as if quieting a small animal, then lifted her gaze toward me with that rare look she reserves for moments when she knows I have planned something and wants to offer permission without taking ownership, and I met her eyes not to ask for help, but to confirm that everything was proceeding as intended. The revenge, for tonight, would not be a speech or a slap. It would be the simple elegance of timing, the dignity of letting truth arrive through the front door carrying its own evidence, and as the room tightened again, I heard the faintest creak in Ethan's voice. The first hairline fracture in a mask that had been lacquered for years, and my grandmother drew a careful breath the way she does before reciting a recipe she knows by heart, and she placed the phone gently beside her plate with the screen tilted just enough that the headline glowed like a small moon, and she set her napkin down as if she were closing a ledger, and then she said my name in that soft, even tone that always makes the men in our family sit up and listen. And the knife in Ethan's hand hovered above the ham as though any movement might invite the drop that every person at the table, whether they understood it or not, had been dreading and craving in equal measure. My grandmother said my name as if she were asking me to pass the salt, and then, with the same effortless calm she uses to remind my uncle that interest compounds whether he believes in it or not, she turned her face toward Ethan and asked, in a voice that did not rise or tremble, why he felt so certain about surviving in technology when, according to the alert that had just lit up her phone, my company had quietly acquired his, and the effect was immediate and surgical, a clean incision. Through the chatter that left the entire table staring at her screen as though truth itself had been plated beside the ham, while Ethan's knife remained suspended midair like a prop abandoned by a stagehand who suddenly realized the script had changed. Silence in a family like ours is rarely noble, it is practical, the body bracing for a blow, and as it stretched across the table, I watched surprise bloom into calculation on faces I have known since childhood. My mother's eyes flitting to my father as though gauging whether parental loyalty could be renegotiated. My aunt blinking at me as if discovering there had been a second daughter under her nose all along, and Ethan, who loves an audience and believes in momentum like it is oxygen, let out a quick exhale that he tried to pass off as amusement, then settled into that lazy grin he uses when he needs 5 seconds to decide whether to lie, deny, or charm the problem into leaving. I did not rescue him from the seconds. I let them stack, because time can be a lever when you have prepared the fulcrum, and I had prepared it with more care than anyone at that table would ever admit. From the embargo timing I negotiated so the announcement would drop on a quiet holiday evening when tech reporters were bored and family phones were out on linen, to the non-disclosure carve-outs that allowed for a single line of confirmation if asked, to the way I had gently taught my grandmother to follow the local business journal so that the alert would come to her first rather than to Ethan's curated chorus, and when he glanced at me, searching for a lifeline he could spin into a narrative where he still won. I picked up my water and took a slow sip that told him the ocean between perception and reality was about to swallow the little island he had been building out of adjectives. "Grandma," he began, all smooth apology and practiced warmth, explaining that small deals happen all the time, that it was a strategic partnership, that the media loves to dramatize, and he almost got away with it until my grandmother, who raised 3 children on ledgers and never met a euphemism she couldn't pin to the mat, tilted the phone toward him so the headline shone full and merciless, the words asset purchase and team integration, glowing like a porch light that eliminates convenient shadows, and then she turned the screen toward my father, who read the first paragraph aloud with the solemnity of a judge delivering a sentence, and, halfway through the line that named my company as the acquirer and his sons as the target, faltered, cleared his throat, and finished without looking up. If this were a courtroom drama, I would stand and deliver a monologue about merit and patience, but I prefer consequences to speeches, so my revenge arrived with the same grace as the news, not as a gloat, but as a reframe. And when my mother finally found her voice to ask me, small and brittle, whether this was some kind of hostile move, I smiled in a way that should have reassured her and answered that the most compassionate thing you can do for employees is remove uncertainty before payday. That we had offered retention packages that beat the market, that customers would keep their service without a hiccup, and that sometimes survival looks like a lifeboat arriving without a marching band, a statement that soothed the table while landing squarely, and intentionally, on the exposed nerve in Ethan's insistence that survival belonged to him alone. He set the knife down with a soft clink that sounded louder than every compliment he had collected over the years, then leaned forward with a smirk that could have been charming if it were not so frightened around the edges, and told me he hoped I enjoyed playing savior because the acquisition structure meant I was taking on a lot of code he would not personally maintain, then added that market conditions were rough and that he, of course, had options, which was when I leaned in too. Kept my voice light and reminded him that options vest according to schedules and that earnouts are funny creatures who only eat real revenue, then asked whether he would like more potatoes while sliding, under the table, a small white envelope toward my grandmother containing a printed letter on company paper that appointed her, effective immediately, as the honorary chair of a tiny family foundation we had just endowed in her name to sponsor scholarships for first-generation college students. Learning the boring skills that keep businesses honest, a gesture that changed the soundtrack of the moment from scandal to legacy without denying the sting. The atmosphere loosened a notch as my grandmother's eyes filled with the kind of pleased disbelief that makes an old woman look both younger and more formidable. My father exhaled through his nose as if he had been holding his breath since January, and my aunt reached for her glass with the shaky gratitude of someone who has discovered that the hero she picked for the family novel might not be the one who finishes the chapter, yet beneath the relief a new current began to pull, subtle and unsettling, because victory in families never lands cleanly, it drags old sediment with it, and when Ethan finally spoke, not to the table but to me, across the centerpiece that suddenly felt like a hedge, he asked, almost gently, whether I had made sure to acquire everything I thought I had, because sometimes founders park valuable assets inside entities to protect them from exactly this kind of deal, and the question slipped into the room like a draft under a locked door, lifting the napkins. Again. While my phone, silent until now, vibrated once in my pocket with a message from legal that contained a single sentence and a document link I had not expected to see until Monday morning. The vibration in my pocket felt like the smallest possible earthquake, the kind that rattles a picture frame but leaves the house standing, and as the table leaned into Ethan's insinuation with a hush that tasted like cold metal, I slid my hand beneath the tablecloth, unlocked my phone with the muscle memory of 1,000 commuter mornings, and saw the message from legal framed in the sterile calm of corporate language that has ruined and saved more lives than any sermon. The sentence was short, by design yet almost luxurious in what it contained, a confirmation that the assignment agreements for intellectual property had been filed with the state and that the escrow would release upon tomorrow's bank confirmation, plus a link to a scanned document I knew, even before opening it, would carry the signature that mattered, because despite Ethan's swagger and his talent for polishing air into marble, his board had insisted on a last-minute consolidation to cover payroll. A move that swept the assets he thought he had hidden into a basket we had already purchased while he was busy shopping for new office furniture that looked great in photos and did nothing for the balance sheet. I did not smile, because victory that is savored too visibly becomes petty rather than clean, and I wanted clean, yet I allowed myself one indulgence that functioned as a kind of dessert I could eat without guilt, a small revenge with a calm face. So I set the phone beside my plate where no one could see the screen and asked my brother, with a gentleness that would have fooled a stranger, whether he remembered the summer our grandmother taught us to label jam jars properly because mislabeling caused waste and waste was a sin, and he nodded warily, thinking, perhaps, that I was retreating into sentiment, while I continued, almost conversationally, that grown-ups put labels on assets for the same reason. Not to stifle genius, but to keep winter from being cruel, and that sometimes the label a founder thinks he has hidden under the shelf is the one a patient bookkeeper finds first, which is how the pantry stays stocked when the snow comes early, and my grandmother, catching the metaphor, tapped the envelope I had given her and told the table that the first scholarships would be announced on Memorial Day if the market did not eat everyone alive before then, a line that made even my father chuckle despite himself, as if the moment could be softened into a family joke rather than settled into a new reality. Ethan quirked his mouth, a gesture that used to signal triumph but now resembled uncertainty rehearsing for composure, and he leaned toward me with the kind of brotherly intimacy he deploys when the audience feels fragile, asking whether, as a matter of simple fairness, I would be willing to carve out a license for the tool he swore he developed before the deal, a minor component that he insisted had sentimental value, and in another life I might have called it mercy to accommodate him, yet. Tonight I had a different definition of mercy, one that involved treating him like the competent adult he kept claiming to be. So I said that if the tool existed as he described it, then the contracts already accounted for it, and that my team would be happy to evaluate a license proposal provided it included proof of development timelines and security audits. And I let the phrase security audits do the heavy lifting, because people who hide things rarely enjoy lights turned on by someone else. My mother reached for my hand the way she did when I was small and afraid of thunderstorms, and she asked, in a voice that had lost its polish, whether I had planned all of this. Not only the acquisition and the timing and the foundation letter, but the moment of revelation itself, the single line from my grandmother that had cut my brother's act in two like fabric. And it would have been easy to claim that I was merely allowing truth to arrive on schedule, yet I could see the fear beneath her question, the fear that she had misjudged her children for years, so I chose a different kind of revenge, the kind that feels like grace when you administer it carefully. And I told her that I had planned the business moves with the help of people who did not care about our family theater, that I had planned the scholarship because our grandmother had quietly paid for my first coding class when I could not afford it, and that I had not planned her line because you cannot choreograph a woman who survive the kind of economy she did, you can only give her the right information and trust her to use it. Which made my grandmother laugh, that low, satisfied laugh of hers, and earned me a look from Ethan that said he did not know whether to call me a liar or a tactician, and perhaps the answer was that I was both. The table returned to movement like a city after a power outage, forks scraping, glasses clinking, stories sprouting like weeds in the cracks left by the quake, and even as the room warmed, I felt the quiet pull of a new undertow. Because deals end chapters, but they do not settle novels, and when my phone buzzed again with a second message, this one from a product lead who never texts on holidays, my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with triumph, since the note contained a small complication written in the kind of neutral detail that makes engineers sound like surgeons. An observation that one of the public-facing microservices had dependencies mapped to a third-party domain that had been registered years ago in the name of a shell company, and that the transfer request, though initiated, was awaiting verification. Which meant nothing would explode tonight, yet something could wobble on Tuesday if signatures did not land in the right inboxes, and I looked up to find Ethan, watching me with the half-smile of a gambler who has rolled a number he likes, perhaps believing he had buried a bone deep enough to be interesting. I could have confronted him in front of our family, could have read the note aloud and asked him to swear, hand on the ham, that he had not planted a booby trap in code he once described as elegant, but what I actually wanted was not a confession. It was leverage tied to better behavior than he had shown me, so I stood, smoothed my napkin, and told the room that dessert was in the kitchen and that I would help plate it, then paused behind Ethan's chair and, without bending, said that if he felt like earning an advisory contract that would keep him paid through the end of the year, he could meet me at the office on Monday, with a complete list of the artifacts he might have forgotten to label. And I added that transparency earns generosity faster than excuses, and I left the sentence hanging there like a coat offered at the door of a storm. In the kitchen, my grandmother joined me, sliding the pie toward the light, and she asked, not in a whisper but without edge, whether I was finished, whether the thing I had carried for years had finally been set down. And I told her that it felt more like placing it on a different shelf where it could not fall on my head, because survival in technology is less a crown and more a pantry. You keep it stocked and you keep the labels honest, and you do not brag, because the weather does not care about your adjectives, and we carried the plates back into the dining room where my father sat straighter and my mother pretended to be cross about sugar while watching me the way people watch the ocean at night, beautifully and nervously. And Ethan accepted his slice with a joke about carbs and innovation that drew laughter from the cousins and did nothing to close the space between us, a space that might one day be a bridge if he chose to build one and might remain a river if he decided to admire his reflection instead of learning to swim. When I finally stood to leave, coat over my arm and the envelope for my grandmother tucked into her apron as if philanthropy were simply another kitchen chore, Ethan caught my eye and asked whether I had really known the exact moment the news would hit, whether I had wanted him to hear it in front of everyone instead of alone, and I said that timing is a tool like any other and that families, for all their warmth and mess, understand tools when they are used with care. Then I kissed my grandmother's cheek and stepped into the dark that smelled like wet earth and lilacs, and as the door clicked shut I let the messages on my phone bloom again, one safe, one sharp. And I thought about how some acquisitions rescue companies and some acquisitions rescue narratives, and how, on certain holidays, the rescue remains unfinished by design because a thread left untied keeps everyone honest. And I walked to my car wondering whether Ethan would show up on Monday morning with a clean list and a clean face, or whether he would hold on to the myth that had carried him this far, and I did not answer the question even to myself, because sometimes the most satisfying revenge is the future you have not decided to distribute yet.